Yes, I'm Ralph K. Manley from Springfield, Missouri, and I was with the 501st Parachute Infantry, 101st Airborne Division in Bastogne and War II. Yes, actually I was in Paris on a 24-hour pass after we just returned from Holland. And a loudspeaker came on and says, all units report to your units immediately, as quickly as possible, any way possible. So we returned then from Paris back to our unit and immediately got on what clothes we had, and I still had on my Class A for, of course, being in Paris. And we loaded onto port battalion trucks, these semi-trucks that had 4-foot sidewalls on them and open tops, whatever, and loaded onto those without overcoats or without overshoes, and headed towards the bulge. And it was very cold. We met troops that was coming out, wounded, this, that, and the other, walking as we crossed paths, going in and them coming out. Those who were disenchanted by having been overrun by the Germans and so on, and a truck with maybe a series of bodies on it, and as one rounded the corner, some of the pieces of bodies fell off the truck. And at that time, they had grouped together clerks, anybody that was a soldier, to go to the front. And some of those, not having seen that, just keeled over in their tracks, so on, because they had not seen that type of wartime before. We did not know actually what was going on. We did know, as we had been on pass in Paris, every person returned to your unit immediately as quickest way possible. And so as we got back to our unit at Mourmelon, France, then we got our equipment and our guns and whatever, and we're on trucks in minutes and headed off to Bastogne. We didn't know the situation. We just know it was cold, and we had to go as we were without overshoes or overcoats. And again, with 0 degrees, you can imagine that in open-air trucks going there, put in like cattle, you might say, on trucks that weren't covered. They were actually port battalion trucks that were used to hauling merchandise from the ships out to the warehousing areas. And so that's what we rode to Bastogne on. And once we got there, of course, it was just dismount and head up the road to the city. So I was out on the edge in a foxhole, and in this case, the ground was frozen, but coming out of a barn lot with all the pheasants and cattle stuff that was coming out, it was easier to dig a foxhole there, so you can imagine what I must have smelled like. And that part with a bazooka, so on. And with the bazooka, to shoot at tanks that were coming in, and certainly that's what we did, and disabled some tanks that were coming on through with the bazooka, but they got very close. So on. And it was one of, oftentimes maybe with 2 in a hole, but in this case it was just 1 because the ground was so hard to dig, at least on the surface and with the snow, and you didn't want to reveal your position because of the black dirt on top of the white snow. So you had to get snow and cover over the soil that you dug out of the foxhole. From the foxhole, actually, it was a defensive position. Normally, we were very lightly equipped with rapid-firing weapons, folding stock carbines, that type of thing, rocket launchers or bazookas, as we might call them, anti-tank mines, things like that, on the defensive there, as opposed to being on the attacking part. And there, of course, not knowing fully the situation, we blocked all the roads so no more could come into the city of Bastogne with our outlying positions there. And some of the people, of course, were in the city of Bastogne, hadn't got any farther than the city itself. And so it was one of really not knowing and being familiar with what was really happening, except the enemy was attacking and you wanted to stop them, and that part we did. As a paratroop unit, we were always surrounded, what have you, so that part didn't bother us, so on. Of course, we were not armed with tanks or vehicles or anti-tank guns or tanks or anything of that nature. We were a light, fast-firing type of units, and so we had our rifles and our hand grenades and our anti-tank mines and things of that nature, and our explosive composition C, 25 pounds of it, as a matter of fact, with each demolitionist. So we could mold that around, actually throw it on the engine of a tank as it passed us and blow the engine on the tank to get it out of commission of the Germans.
Did
Composition C explosive is a putty-like type of thing, and by molding a ball of that and putting a fuse and blasting cap in it, then we could throw that on the back of a tank where the engine was, and would blow the engine of the tank, so it would incapacitate the tank.
Do you remember the Germans bombing Bastogne?
Yes, they did.
Do you remember that?
Yes, I do. Actually, I was on the second story of a building there at that time with field glasses trying to cover the roads and see what was coming. And the artillery and bombing of the building began to fall down. So I jumped out of the window of this building, since it was crumbling, and into the street of rubble below from this building. And actually, I broke several toes in my foot, but that was so minor that you didn't bother at that until years later I had it repaired. Weather had broke, and in came planes of the Allies to help us out, and were we happy to see that. Christmas time, and of course you're away from home, and we're here to call on to defend our country, and we wanted to give it the best we could. In the meantime, the Germans had dropped leaflets for them, leaflets saying this was our pass to warm bed, and if we wanted to see our sweethearts again, and so on. The type of leaflets that was trying to encourage us to give up. And of course, that was a perfect paper for us to use to relieve ourselves, what have you. Of course, they'd play the Christmas carols that we would hear, and then trying to encourage us to do. And you can see why General McAuliffe sent the word nuts when we were asked to surrender, because actually it was probably much more than that, but that was printable stuff, so on. We kind of used some vulgar words at the time that we wouldn't use in the press or today. But anyway, the nuts has centered on for this many years from that, because we were not about to give up. But even though they encouraged us to, the Germans did, so on. But it did block their advance on there, and that was the end of it for that part. Even in digging some of the foxholes around, some of them came across the gardens that had some potatoes left and things like that, black potatoes that had been frozen and so on, but it was something to eat. And even one of us killed a chicken that about froze to death, I think, and ate that raw chicken in order to have something to eat on that. Because we did not get a resupply of K rations, and K rations is all we had in the paratroops. We didn't have the C's or the D's or what have you, that troops that had trucks and vehicles, because we had no vehicles there. The Germans were every place, it seemed, but somehow or another we managed, despite the cold and despite the threat of our feet being frozen from the wet snow on our boots, and then we'd take off our boots and in the foxhole and rub our toes, because otherwise gangrene would set in on a number of people, and you had frostbite and all from your toes, which greatly bothered many of them because they couldn't walk anymore. Their toes had been frozen, you see. Actually, we try to get 2 men to a foxhole so one could get, 5 minutes sleep, 10 minutes sleep, and 2 men could keep each other warmer than one man by himself. And then while one could take off your boots and rub your toes and maybe take your wet socks, put under your arms or in your crotch of your legs to dry from the heat of your body, so on, so that you could put them back on and protect your feet. And I did not get frostbite on my feet because of taking off your boots and rubbing. With 2 men in a foxhole, one would be firing and the other could be working there until you were needed, and drying your feet and so forth. Well, to get close to about the 16th or 17th of January, as a matter of fact, I think, when we knew it. Because it seemed like about a month from the time it started till the time that it was turned the opposite against the Germans. And of course, after that, you could take prisoners by the hundreds, so on, from the Germans, because they knew that that was the end of it. So from that moment on, it was one of not defending positions. It was one of taking prisoners from the Germans, so on, and knew that the war was over then, because at that time, when you had whole units would surrender to you, and you were not equipped. We as paratroop used to handle that many. So we might corral them in a barnyard or something of that nature and strip them of their weapons, so on, to hold them until the ground troops troops got there and could take over that position.